originally published by Afterhours Archive 613. This audio edition is adapted from the original written article. Afterhours Archive 613 Commentary. More than a record. Vinyl's revival is about more than nostalgia. It reflects a changing relationship with music, ownership, craftsmanship, and the growing responsibility to make physical media more sustainable. Editorial note: vinyl's resurgence has often been reduced to a simple story of nostalgia or a debate over whether records sound better than digital music. Both ideas contain elements of truth, but neither fully explains why a format many believed would disappear has become one of the music industry's most remarkable success stories. Behind the renewed interest in records lies a broader conversation about how we experience music, how we value ownership in an increasingly digital world, and how an industry built on physical media is confronting the environmental responsibilities that come with its revival. Every generation believes it is witnessing the end of an older technology. History is filled with predictions that the next innovation will permanently replace whatever came before it. Radio was expected to diminish the importance of live performance. Television was expected to transform entertainment forever. Vinyl gradually gave way to cassette tapes. Cassettes surrendered to compact discs. CDs were eclipsed by digital downloads. Downloads eventually yielded to streaming platforms capable of delivering millions of songs instantly to almost any device with an internet connection. Each iteration promised greater convenience than the last. Music suddenly became smaller, lighter, faster, and increasingly detached from the physical objects that once carried it. Shelves that were once filled with albums became folders of digital files before disappearing almost entirely into cloud-based libraries existing only as data. Listeners no longer needed to decide what to bring with them because entire catalogs traveled inside a smartphone. The evolution made perfect sense. Technology had solved a problem that previous generations simply accepted as part of listening to music. For many listeners, however, something became harder to find: the experience of listening to an album from beginning to end, allowing it to tell its story without interruption, advertisements, or the temptation to constantly move on to something else. Then something unexpected happened. Just as streaming platforms had become the dominant way many people listened to music, vinyl records quietly began returning to record stores. What initially appeared to be a niche hobby for collectors developed into one of the industry's most surprising revivals. Independent record stores expanded their vinyl sections. Major retailers once again dedicated shelf space to LPs. Pressing plants struggled to keep pace with demand. Artists across nearly every genre, from independent musicians to global superstars, once again viewed vinyl as an essential part of releasing an album. In many ways, it marked a return to storytelling instead of feeding an ever-changing algorithm that never seems to be satisfied. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this revival is not that listeners who grew up with records returned to them. Nostalgia is a powerful force, and every generation develops affection for the formats that shaped its youth. More surprising is the enthusiasm shown by listeners who never experienced vinyl during its original era. Many younger collectors grew up surrounded by streaming services and wireless speakers. They never knew a world in which placing a record on a turntable was the ordinary way to listen to music. Yet they have embraced a format that requires more space, more care, more expense, and considerably more patience than nearly every alternative available today. At first glance, that decision seems almost irrational. Why would anyone willingly choose a format that requires them to stand up halfway through an album to flip the record over? Why accept surface noise, careful storage requirements, and the possibility of scratches when pristine digital playback is available almost instantly? If convenience alone determined the future of music, vinyl should have disappeared decades ago. Its survival suggests that convenience has never been the only thing listeners value. Discussions about vinyl often become trapped in familiar arguments about sound quality. Some listeners describe analog recordings as warmer or more natural, while others argue that modern lossless digital formats reproduce music with extraordinary accuracy. Audio engineers continue to debate mastering techniques, dynamic range, playback equipment, and countless technical details that influence what ultimately reaches the listener's ears. Those conversations are interesting, but they also risk overlooking something far more significant. People are not simply returning to vinyl because of how it sounds. They are returning because of how it feels to fully experience music. Listening to a record begins long before the first note emerges from the speakers. It starts with carefully choosing an album rather than allowing an algorithm to decide what comes next. It continues through a process of being present, removing the record from its sleeve, placing it on the turntable, lowering the stylus, and watching the grooves begin their slow rotation. Even today, the ingenuity behind that process remains remarkable. Holding the album artwork in both hands becomes part of the experience instead of reducing it to a thumbnail image. The lyrics, recording credits, photographs, and essays printed inside the sleeve become part of the experience instead of hidden behind hyperlinks that many listeners never open. It is an identity that was quietly lost as digital formats became the norm. Every album carried its own visual language, from the artwork and typography to the lyric sheets and liner notes. Together, they created an experience that extended beyond the music itself, encouraging patience, presence, and immersion in ways that remain difficult to replicate digitally. Perhaps most importantly, records encourage commitment. Artists have always spent a considerable amount of time determining the sequence of an album. An album's track listing is rarely placed in random order. The opening track is often intended to introduce listeners to the atmosphere and set the stage for the journey they are about to take with the artist. Each transition between songs shapes the packing of the entire work. Closing tracks often leave a lasting emotional impression. Sometimes there is even a hidden track waiting as an unexpected gift for the listener. During the height of vinyl's popularity, listeners generally experience those creative decisions exactly as intended, because skipping tracks required lifting the needle and physically moving it across the record. Today, streaming services make it effortless to jump between songs, create playlists from dozens of different artists, or allow algorithms to assemble listening sessions based on previous habits. Neither approach is inherently better. They simply encourage different relationships with music. Streaming has become one of the greatest tools for musical discovery ever created. Independent artists can reach global audiences without manufacturing physical copies or negotiating traditional distribution agreements. Listeners can explore genres from around the world in minutes, revisit forgotten recordings, or discover emerging musicians whose work might never have reached them through older systems. The accessibility created by streaming has fundamentally changed the music industry for the better in many ways. Full script Part 2 of 4. Vinyl has traditionally served a different purpose. It was never about maximizing access. It encouraged presence and attention. That distinction may help explain why records have returned during a period when distraction and increasingly fragmented attention have become defining characteristics of modern life. While the human experience has evolved alongside the internet, many everyday habits have changed with it. Notifications now compete constantly for our attention. Social media platforms encourage rapid scrolling from one idea to the next. Music itself often becomes background sound accompanying work, commuting, studying, or exercise. The ability to skip a song after only a few seconds has become so commonplace that many listeners rarely experience an album exactly as the artist intended. Vinyl quietly resists that pace. A record asks something of the listener. It asks for time. It asks for presence. It asks for the willingness to sit with an album rather than constantly searching for whatever comes next. The experience does not reject modern technology, nor does it suggest that every listening session should become a ceremonial event. Instead, it offers an alternative rhythm. In a culture increasingly defined by speed, records remind us that slowing down still has value. That idea extends beyond listening itself. Physical ownership carries a meaning that digital access cannot fully replicate. Streaming libraries feel limitless, yet they remain temporary in ways many listeners rarely consider. Albums can disappear when licensing agreements expire. Artists occasionally remove their catalogs from platforms. Subscription services change prices, features, and availability. The listener's access depends on companies maintaining infrastructure that exists beyond their control. A record sitting on a shelf belongs to its owner in a different sense. It can be loaned to a friend, inherited by family members, rediscovered years later, or sold to another collector who continues its story. The object accumulates its own history. A slightly worn sleeve recalls years of careful listening. A signature collected after a concert transforms an album into a personal memory. Handwritten notes tucked inside the jacket, price stickers from long-closed record stores, or fatting ownership labels become small pieces of cultural history that exist alongside the music itself. Collectors often describe records as preserving memories, but perhaps records preserve something even larger. They preserve context, atmosphere, and a reminder of what it means to be fully present in a moment. An album released on vinyl exists as more than a collection of songs. It documents graphic design, photography, typography, production credits, recording studios, musicians, engineers, lyricists, and visual identity within a single object. Holding an original pressing from decades ago provides insight into the artistic and cultural environment that produced it. Records become historical artifacts as much as entertainment products. That perspective has always been central to archives, museums, and libraries. Cultural preservation rarely focuses on preserving only the information itself. It also preserves the objects that carried it because those objects tell stories of their own. Music deserves the same consideration. For decades, discussions about physical media largely centered on practicality. Which format held more songs? Which sounded better? Which was easier to carry? Which cost less to manufacture? Vinyl's return suggests that another question has quietly emerged alongside those familiar comparisons. What parts of the musical and human experience were lost as technology became more efficient? The answer may be found in the difference between convenience and meaning. Technology has become extraordinarily effective at removing friction from everyday life. Messages travel instantly. Films begin with the press of a button. Entire libraries of books can be stored on a tablet no thicker than a magazine. Music followed the same path, becoming more accessible with every technological leap. In many respects, this represents genuine progress. Fewer barriers separate artists from listeners than at any other point in history, and independent musicians have opportunities that previous generations could scarcely imagine. Progress, however, rarely arrives without trade-offs. As music became increasingly accessible, it also became easier to consume without intention. Albums were replaced by playlists. Playlists gave way to algorithmically generated recommendations. Songs often became interchangeable pieces of an endless stream designed to continue indefinitely. Discovery flourished, but permanence became more difficult to define. The relationship between listener and music shifted from ownership toward access, from collections toward subscriptions, and from carefully chosen albums toward vast libraries in which individual recordings competed constantly for attention. None of this represents a failure of streaming. It reflects exactly what streaming was designed to accomplish. The format prioritizes availability, convenience, and discovery, and it succeeds remarkably well at all three. Millions of artists who might never have reached audiences through traditional distribution can now share their work across continents almost instantly. Listeners can explore unfamiliar genres, revisit forgotten recordings, and support independent musicians in ways that simply were not possible only a few decades ago. Vinyl was never meant to compete on those terms. Instead, its revival reminds us that accessibility and experience are not the same thing. A record asks the listener to participate. It cannot become background noise quite as easily because interacting with it requires deliberate action. That difference may explain why so many younger listeners have embraced vinyl despite growing up surrounded by digital technology. They are not rejecting innovation. They are seeking an experience that digital formats were never intended to provide. The resurgence of vinyl, however, has also brought renewed attention to a question that cannot be ignored. Every record begins as a physical object, and physical objects require resources to manufacture. Modern records are primarily produced from polyvinyl chloride, commonly known as PVC, a durable plastic derived from fossil fuel feedstocks. While PVC contributes to the longevity that collectors value, its production carries environmental consequences that have become increasingly difficult to overlook. Manufacturing requires energy. Transportation generates emissions. Records that ultimately enter landfill may persist for extremely long periods, while presenting additional environmental concerns. For many years, these realities received relatively little public attention. Vinyl represented only a small portion of the music market, and environmental discussions surrounding music tended to focus more heavily on electronic waste or the rapid turnover of consumer electronics. As record sales accelerated, however, manufacturers, artists, labels, researchers, and consumers began asking more difficult questions about the environmental cost of producing millions of new LPs every year. More importantly, the conversation has moved beyond simply identifying the problem. Full script part 3 of 4. Rather than dismissing environmental concerns or suggesting that vinyl should simply disappear, significant parts of the industry have begun exploring practical ways to reduce its impact. Record pressing plants have invested in reclaiming manufacturing scrap that would previously have been discarded, grinding rejected records and production offcuts into material that can be incorporated into future pressings. Other facilities have introduced lower carbon transportation strategies, improved energy efficiency, and more comprehensive life cycle assessments that examine environmental impacts from raw material extraction through manufacturing, shipping, and eventual disposal. Manufacturers are also exploring production models that better align manufacturing with actual demand. For emerging artists, print-on-demand services and individually produced records, often created using lathe-cut technology, offer a way to sell physical music without committing to large production runs or carrying excess inventory. While these records generally come at a higher cost per unit and may not match the audio fidelity of traditionally pressed vinyl, they reduce financial risk and unnecessary overproduction. Established artists and record labels typically continue to rely on conventional pressing methods, where larger production runs deliver higher sound quality and lower per-unit costs, but also require greater upfront investment and carry the possibility of unsold stock. Together, these approaches illustrate that sustainability is not only about the materials used to manufacture records, but also about producing quantities that better reflect genuine demand. Innovation has also extended beyond the pressing plants themselves. Companies specializing in polymer recycling are working alongside manufacturers to create more circular production systems that recover PVC waste and return it to the manufacturing process, instead of allowing it to become landfill. Researchers and manufacturers continue experimenting with alternative compounds, bio-based materials, and production methods designed to reduce emissions, while maintaining the quality that listeners expect from a vinyl record. Not every experiment succeeds. Some alternative materials introduce higher surface noise. Others remain difficult to scale economically. Questions surrounding durability, contamination, manufacturing consistency, and long-term performance continue to shape research and development throughout the industry. Yet the willingness to pursue those solutions represents an important cultural shift. The conversation has moved beyond defending vinyl toward improving it. For many years, environmental discussions often presented consumers with an uncomfortable choice. One either embraced physical media and accepted its environmental cost, or abandoned it entirely in favor of digital alternatives. The reality is considerably more complex. Streaming itself depends upon energy-intensive data centers, telecommunications infrastructure, network equipment, and electronic devices, whose manufacturing and eventual disposal also carry environmental consequences. Academic researchers have noted that the environmental impact of different listening formats depends not only on how music is delivered, but also on how frequently it is consumed, and the broader life cycle associated with each medium. The comparison, therefore, is not as simple as asking which format is greener. It is better understood as a question of stewardship. A record purchased, carefully maintained, and enjoyed over decades tells a different environmental story than one purchased impulsively and quickly discarded. Likewise, endlessly streaming the same album through remote servers involves a different pattern of energy consumption than listening to a locally stored recording or repeatedly playing a physical copy already sitting on a shelf. Responsible listening is shaped not only by technology, but also by the habits surrounding its use. This perspective opens another conversation that often receives less attention than manufacturing itself. Second-hand record stores have always played an important role within music culture. Long before sustainability became a common topic of discussion, used record shops extended the lives of albums by moving them from one collection to another. Records passed between family members, traded among collectors, or discovered in neighborhood shops represent one of the simplest examples of a circular economy already functioning within music culture. Every album purchased secondhand reduces demand for new manufacturing, while preserving an object that was designed to endure. Independent record stores contribute something equally valuable. They are not simply retail spaces. They remain places where recommendations are exchanged through conversation rather than algorithms, where local scenes develop, and where physical music continues to exist as a shared cultural experience. Browsing shelves encourages curiosity in ways fundamentally different from scrolling through recommendations generated by software. One experience is driven primarily by prediction. The other leaves room for surprise. Artists have also begun reconsidering the environmental implications of physical releases. Some have embraced recycled vinyl compounds, reduced packaging, sustainably sourced paper products, or lower-impact manufacturing partnerships. Others have examined freight logistics, recognizing that transportation choices contribute significantly to an album's overall environmental footprint. None of these efforts eliminate the environmental cost of producing records, but together, they demonstrate a willingness to treat sustainability as part of the creative process rather than merely a manufacturing concern. This may be where vinyl's revival becomes most interesting. The return of records is not simply reviving an older format. It encourages conversations that rarely occurred during vinyl's original commercial dominance. Listeners today ask where records are manufactured, what materials are used, how they are transported, whether waste can be reduced without sacrificing quality, and how physical media can continue to exist in a world increasingly focused on sustainability. Environmental responsibility has become part of the cultural identity surrounding vinyl, rather than an issue existing entirely outside it. History suggests that music formats rarely disappear completely. New technologies usually expand the ways people listen rather than erasing what came before. Radio survived television. Books survived film. Vinyl survived cassette tapes, compact discs, digital downloads, and streaming. Each continues serving audiences for different reasons because each offers something the others do not. The future of music is unlikely to belong exclusively to any single format. Streaming will remain indispensable for discovery, accessibility, and global distribution. Digital downloads continue serving listeners who value ownership without physical storage. CDs retain advantages in durability, affordability, and high-quality audio. Vinyl occupies its own place within that landscape, offering a listening experience built around attention, craftsmanship, and physical presence. Full script Part 4 of 4. Perhaps that is the most important lesson hidden within vinyl's resurgence. For years, discussions about technology focused almost entirely on what could be made faster, smaller, cheaper, and more convenient. Those goals transformed music in extraordinary ways, making it available to more people than ever before. Yet vinyl's return suggests that progress is not measured solely by efficiency. Sometimes progress also involves recognizing what remains worth preserving. Records remind us that music has always been more than sound. It is memory, design, craftsmanship, storytelling, community, and history contained within an object that asks to be experienced rather than merely accessed. That experience carries responsibilities. As listeners, we shape the future of physical media through the choices we make about what we buy, how we care for it, and whether we treat music as something disposable or something worth preserving. As manufacturers and artists continue investing in cleaner production methods, recycled materials, more sustainable practices, and circular manufacturing, the industry demonstrates that tradition and innovation need not exist in opposition. Vinyl's greatest achievement may not be that it returned after so many predicted its disappearance. Its greatest achievement may be that it reminded us to ask a question that extends far beyond records themselves. In an era defined by speed and convenience, what experiences remain valuable precisely because they ask us to slow down? The answer will be different for every listener. Some will continue streaming every album they discover. Others will spend weekends searching record store shelves for an elusive pressing they have wanted for years. Most will likely do both, moving comfortably between digital convenience and physical ownership depending on the moment. The future of listening does not require choosing one format over another. It requires recognizing that each offers a different way of connecting with music. In the end, vinyl's revival is not simply about preserving an older technology. It is about preserving the idea that some experiences deserve our full attention. As the industry continues rethinking how records are manufactured, transported, recycled, and ultimately valued, the future of physical media will be shaped not only by innovation, but also by intention. That may be the most enduring lesson of vinyl's unexpected return. The grooves pressed into every record tell the story of the music they contain, but they also tell a quieter story about the people who continue choosing to listen, to collect, and to preserve something they believe is worth keeping. This audio edition was adapted from the original written article, published by Afterhours Archive 613. References and source materials are available in the original written article, published by Afterhours Archive 613 on Substack.